Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, David Roll, author of George Marshall, Defender of the Republic.
David Roll, author of George Marshall, Defender of the Republic. Why'd you write about George Marshall?
Well, I had two books that preceded it that led me directly to George Marshall's doorstep. I wrote a book about Lewis Johnson that most people probably never heard of him. He was Secretary of Defense under Harry Truman, but he bookended Marshall's career. He helped him become Chief of Staff in 1938, and in 1950, when Johnson was Secretary of Defense, he got fired by Truman, and Marshall replaced him. And Marshall knew a lot about Johnson, and there were letters that went back and forth. And the second book I wrote was about Harry Hopkins, who was Roosevelt's closest advisor, lived in the White House for 3.5 years. And Hopkins became the intermediary between President Roosevelt and Marshall. Marshall did not want to get too close to Roosevelt for a lot of reasons. So he used Harry Hopkins as a medium to sort of understand what's going on in Roosevelt's head. What's he thinking about on this? And they became great friends. They were very, very different people. So I got intrigued by Marshall. Marshall was a much more, I think, more difficult character to kind of penetrate. But it was a challenge. And of course, anyone who gets into his career has to admire the man. So I started on it and managed to convince my agent that, and then my agent expanded the project, so it became a much longer book than I had originally intended.
Well, you say in the start of the book, General George Marshall, who served under 10 presidents, occupies a singular place in the history of the 20th century, yet his significance is fading from public memory. Why is that?
I think that's because a lot of even the generals are receding from public memory, given the fact that the Second World War is more than 70 years ago. But the ones I think who have lasted longer in memory are people like George Patton, Dwight Eisenhower, MacArthur, because they were flamboyant. They had outsized personalities. Of course, Eisenhower became president. Whereas Marshall was quiet, humble, selfless, often unassuming, was not a great speaker, but yet he was there for most of the major events, the historic events of the first half of the 20th century. He had a ubiquitous presence, and probably had more influence than any of those individuals. But to bring him back to life was a challenge, and I had a lot of fun doing it.
Well, for people who don't know, what was Marshall's job in relation to those other generals you mentioned, Patton, MacArthur, Eisenhower?
During the Second World War.
During the Second World War, yeah.
Of course, he had also an exemplary career in the First World War, but the Second World War, the day the war broke out in Europe, September 1, 1939, Marshall was appointed on that very day to be Chief of Staff of the United States Army. And he had that position throughout the war, so it was almost 6 years by the time he resigned, 1945. So during that period, he organized, he trained, he supplied an army of more than 8 million men and women. He was the dominant voice on matters of Allied strategy, grand strategy, with the British and the Americans. He was the most influential of all of the people that ran the war. with the exception of the president. And then he basically mentored Dwight Eisenhower, brought him in, and one of the first people he brought into his staff was General Eisenhower as soon as the Pearl Harbor attack took place. As his chief of war plans, he mentored Eisenhower, he schooled him, he gave him a long leash in North Africa. Eisenhower made a lot of mistakes, but he kept, he gave him his loyalty, and Eisenhower reciprocated. They were a real team. And Eisenhower grew, of course, took over the command of Overlord and the army in Europe. So it was not only Eisenhower, but when Marshall, during the interim years between World War I and World War II, was at Fort Benning, and he had a chance to evaluate and assess, train, and mentor many of the top dozens of the Army officers who became generals during the Second World War. So, a lot of influence.
When the war started and Marshall became chief of staff, did he sort of understand that the United States was eventually going to get into the European war?
No, not at the beginning. 1939, the whole, we were separated by the oceans. Japan was way out of the picture at that point. At first, it was all about protecting the Western Hemisphere, and he's been criticized for being overly obsessed with that. But at the beginning, it was, let's just make sure we have a way to defend the Western Hemisphere.
Did he do a military buildup from the beginning?
He couldn't, because politics were such that with the isolationists ruling on the Hill, Roosevelt could not get out ahead of American public opinion. And so they did not want they wanted to increase the Navy because that was part of protecting the Western Hemisphere. And to some extent the Air Force, but in terms of an army, until after Pearl Harbor, the army was no larger than that of Bulgaria or Portugal. We were like the 18th or 19th largest army in the country.
Was there a draft?
In the world.
Was there a draft?
There was a draft. There was a draft in 1940, finally, before we got in the war. It's the first time we've ever had a draft, a peacetime draft. And it was, you got to hand it to, actually there's a whole story about it in the book. The impetus for the draft came from some New York public-spirited lawyers who came to Washington, lobbied Marshall to get behind a draft. Marshall said, I can't go ahead of the president. And the president wouldn't move. And so finally they got Felix Frankfurter, influential lawyer from Harvard, to lobby the president. And the president, right before the 1940 elections, appointed two Republicans to be his Secretary of War and his Secretary of Navy, Stimson and Knox. And they actually ended up convincing the president to get behind the draft. So a peacetime draft was started in the summer of 1940. But the original draft law, because of pressure from Congress, said that we can draft millions of these GIs, but they will only serve for 18 months. And they can't go abroad. They had to compromise on the first draft law. Unless there was a national emergency, and Congress had to declare a national emergency in order to get them beyond 18 months.
So when the U.S. got into the war, what was Marshall's job?
Oh, extraordinary. His job was, twofold. Number one, raise an army, as fast as possible, so that his philosophy from the very beginning, his thinking from the very beginning was, we're going to have to build an army and we are going to have to take on the Germans. No one else can do it. So he had to build a huge army as fast as possible because at that point, in 1941, Hitler was almost already at the shores of the English Channel. He could have overrun Britain. So number one, build an army. Number two, influence the deployment of troops across the globe by the Allies as well as the United States. So he had to basically lead grand strategy and also create a huge army. The pressures were enormous. In the dark days right after Pearl Harbor, we were losing all over the world. General MacArthur's troops were doomed on the Bataan Peninsula, and we could do nothing in Europe. So the dark days of early 1942 were the most pressure-packed.
He did all his, he operated out of Washington and not
most of the
out
time,
of
yeah, that's
Europe
right.
or the South Pacific.
The command structure that he basically dictated at Christmas 1941, there were a couple of major decisions that he led the making of. First of all, to have the command structure with the British and the Americans centered in Washington. So the Joint Chiefs from the U.S., the Joint Chiefs from England came to the United States, or they had their delegates in the United States, and all the major decisions were made in the United States for both the Pacific theaters and the European theaters.
Are there times he went over to Europe and to the South Pacific during the war?
A lot, yeah. Yes, once we invaded France, for example, he was there 6 days after in Normandy, along with Churchill and the Navy people and so forth. He made an extraordinary trip. MacArthur was, when the war started, MacArthur was already in the Pacific. He was in the Philippines. And he had to be taken out of the Philippines. Marshall was responsible for that. He escaped Corregidor, brought him to Australia because he was far and away the commander who knew more about the Pacific than anyone else. And of course had been a hero in World War I. And one of the surprising things that I learned in doing this book is the deference that General Marshall gave to MacArthur. Even though MacArthur was technically his subordinate, MacArthur was a giant of a figure, and Marshall respected his abilities, and he was extraordinarily deferential to MacArthur.
What did MacArthur think of Marshall?
Well, MacArthur had problems with virtually any other commander in the war. But MacArthur, when MacArthur got 9 hours advance notice of the Pearl Harbor attack when they were coming to the Philippines, he had 9 hours notice that the Japanese were going to attack the Philippine Islands. And Marshall gave him that notice, but he got his planes the B-17s were destroyed on the ground. Marshall could have relieved Marshall. He would have had ample reason to relieve MacArthur of command in December 1941. And I think probably the only time in MacArthur's life he took the initiative and he called Marshall from the Philippines and no one knows exactly what happened in that conversation. But MacArthur's job was on the line, and I think he had to apologize. I think he blamed it on his air commander. But he was in a very difficult position right then. But Marshall stuck with him, and one of the great things he did is in December 1943, after Marshall lost the command of Overlord, we'll talk about that in a minute, he flew more than 10,000 miles the other way from Cairo to a Pacific island, a small Pacific island where MacArthur was stationed at that time.
I think you said in the book that he flew over 3,000 miles of Japanese territory.
Yeah, dangerous flight, and they landed near New Guinea. And MacArthur was leading a brilliant campaign in New Guinea, which was sort of the outpost where we were fighting the Japanese at that time. And he was always complaining, "You're not supplying me with enough army. I don't have any forces." He was making a real jerk of himself. But everybody kind of understood back in Washington. You just have to deal with MacArthur, you know. And he was getting short shift because there wasn't enough to go around. Well, Marshall went all the way out there on his terms. You know, MacArthur wanted to meet in this little small island. You know, he wouldn't meet Marshall at the airport. But
That's right. MacArthur wasn't there when
well, that's
Marshall
another
arrived.
point. That's another time with Truman. But no, he just happened to be out on an island planning an invasion, and MacArthur bent over backwards to assure him we were behind him. We were giving him everything we could possibly have. You know, what do you need? You know, what kind of? He had his own navy at that point. Marshall made sure he had his own navy in the Southern Pacific. So Marshall did everything he could to placate him because we needed him. He made him into a national hero. Marshall was responsible for MacArthur getting a Congressional Medal of Honor when he really didn't deserve it.
I want to ask you about this. Speaking of Pearl Harbor, you say in here, a damning 16-line magic intercept came across Marshall's desk in October 1941. The intercept message number 83 disclosed that Japanese intelligence officials in Tokyo, who had previously focused only on the U.S. fleet movements, were carefully mapping exact locations of each moored warship at Pearl Harbor in 5 specified sectors. Did Marshall have an inkling that the Japanese were interested in Pearl Harbor?
Well, he had it came across his desk. Let's put it that way. That intel. That's called the mapping intel. There was another intel that came across his desk too, but that should have given him more. But he doesn't remember it. He doesn't. And if he did read it, there was so much other intel coming in that he did not attach the significance to it that he probably should have. There was somebody else on the staff who was more worried about that intel than Marshall, and brought it to the attention, not to Marshall, of somebody else down below. But that piece of intel just never, no one ever caught its significance. They were mapping the very harbor, because everybody thought it was going to be in the Philippines. They were convinced it was going to be the Philippines or Guam, somewhere way out in the Pacific, not at Pearl Harbor. And there was another piece of document that came across Marshall's desk. He doesn't remember reading that, where General Short, who was in charge of the Army on Pearl Harbor at the time, General Short thought that he had been directed to prevent sabotage of his airplanes, the Air Force that was on the ground. And so instead of spreading the planes out, which you would normally do if you were expecting an attack from the air, they were all bunched together, wing to wing, as if they were going to be attacked by American Japanese on Pearl Harbor with satchel charges and bombing them. So all of those planes were caught on the ground. But Short let the people back in Washington know that he was planning for sabotage. If someone had read that that piece of information, it did cross Marshall's desk. Marshall doesn't remember ever reading it. They should have said, "Wait a minute, he should not be defending himself against sabotage. He needed to spread his planes out." Nobody ever caught that. And Marshall was faulted for that during one of the Pearl Harbor investigations. Short, of course, got fired early on.
Now, since this is a program about Pennsylvania and Pennsylvanians, we should establish why we're talking about George Marshall. Grew up in Uniontown, Pennsylvania.
Yes, born in 1880, last day of 1880, New Year's Eve. Born in Uniontown, his father was a gregarious businessman, had made a lot of money, then lost it. And then when he made the money, he invested in the Luray Caverns down in Virginia and lost it there. So they were up and down as a family. He had a brother and a sister, older brother, 6 years older, Stuart, and a younger sister, Marie. His mother was a lovely person. She was the daughter of an abolitionist pharmacy guy from northern Kentucky. So they had a house on the National Road, out kind of on the outskirts of Uniontown. I don't know whether that house is still there, but so he grew up in this southwest Pennsylvania town. Coal and coke were the products that the businessmen exploited, and the town boomed because of that. It was a great childhood for him. He was called Flicker, and I think that was because he was a slight kid he ran around through the neighborhoods, did not do well in school. His father worried about him. He overheard his older brother. His older brother went to VMI, Virginia Military Institute, which was in Lexington, Virginia. So his older brother was already out of VMI when when Marshall was 16, and he overheard his brother telling his mother that Flicker would disgrace the family if he went to the VMI, and they should not send him because he was feckless and he had no ambition. And Marshall always remembered that conversation, and he said that hardened him. He said he was going to wipe Stuart's eye with that, which meant, he was going to put it to him. And so, and Marshall begged to go to VMI. He wanted to go to VMI. They had trouble with the money then. His mother had some real estate. She had to sell the real estate to pay for the tuition. And so Marshall entered VMI when he was only 16. In fact, he was late arriving for his rat year due to the fact that he had a touch of the typhoid fever. But his childhood in Uniontown was blissful. He did a lot of fishing, hunting. He learned about the George Washington's battles in the area. His father loved that. His father made much of his heritage. They were distantly related to John Marshall, the famous first Supreme Court Justice, first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But Marshall discounted that. He liked the fact that they were related to Indians and things of that kind.
Well, you also say in here, Marshall's father, George C. Marshall Sr., was a gregarious businessman who viewed the Army as a dead end that offered subsistence salary, few opportunities for rapid advancement, and no social standing.
Right, right.
Did his parents live to see him reach some level of success?
And he had a decent there was a time when he cut off Stuart entirely from but he also didn't have much of a relationship with his father, frankly. He did with his mother. He loved with his mother. His mother died before World War I. In my view, it was kind of surprising. He did not have strong relationships, certainly with his father and his brother. I know he ended up having a long-time relationship, good relationship with Marie.
His sister?
Yeah, his sister, yeah. I think he had deeper relationships with women, intimate relationships with women. We can get into that later, but than he did with close friends. He ended up, one of his lifelong friends was his VMI roommate, who we saw till the end of his life.
Would you tell the story about the time he walked into the White House and just kind of barged in on the president?
Yeah, well, one thing just before that, it reminded me of when we're talking about his boyhood. His second year at VMI, when he was 18, or maybe it was third year, he came back to Uniontown, his hometown, at the end of the summer, August, very hot. And it was just the time when the boys, the soldiers from the Spanish-American War, they called the boys of Company C. Company C were all from Uniontown, and he was there the day of the parade. And it was, they had decorated the town with bunting, and they painted the cobblestones red, white, and blue, and they had bunting around all around the houses. And so he remembered there was a band, and the train came, and those soldiers marched through Uniontown. And it made an indelible impression upon him. And that's when, as I say in the book, he decided that he wanted to be in the United States Army. And so in his senior year, 1901, I'm not sure whether it was the spring of his senior year, I think it was the spring of his senior year, he got some letters from his father. His father was not in the right political party, but he got some letters. He got one letter to introduce him to the Secretary of War and the Attorney General. Got on a train himself, went to Washington, saw the Attorney General, saw the Secretary of War, and then he went to the White House. And he waited in line at this, that time you just went to the door. And there would be a line of people wanting to see the president. And he was eventually taken upstairs, second floor of the White House, where President McKinley was talking to. A lot of them were job seekers, well-wishers, businessmen, whatever, lobbyists. And he had an audience with the president. The president asked him why he was there, and he said he wanted a commission in the United States Army when he graduated from BMI. And I don't know exactly what the president said. He doesn't remember, but the president said, well, thank you very much. And you had to be appointed by the congressional representatives in your state at that time, as we do now. And he got those appointments. He thinks it was because of his trip to see McKinley, and it may well have been. There's not a direct relationship that I could find in the documents. But he got his appointment. He got his commission, which was very hard to get because the Army was being, downsized at that point. So he got his Army commission, despite having average grades of VMI. What he got good grades in was deportment, discipline, and of course he was head of the cadet corps in his senior year.
So you mentioned that he was involved in World War I?
Yes.
Now this would have been like 12 years after he got in the Army. What did he do in the meantime?
Before World War I?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, his first assignment, when he got his commission in 1902, he got married, first of all, in 1902. Had a couple of days for a honeymoon. They spent it at the Willard Hotel, the old Willard, no, it's called the New Willard at that time. And then he was shipped off to the Pacific, to the Philippines with no training. He joined one of the units there that was fighting the insurrectos and trying to maintain some kind of stabilization after the Spanish-American War. They had a lot of revolutionaries in the Philippine jungles. So that's when he got his first test of learning about the Army. And then he established a reputation throughout the Army at that time. The Army was a small place. In 1912 or so, when he directed, as a first lieutenant, he was the head of these amazing maneuvers, mock battles in the Philippines. And he ended up leading one of the invading force. They were pretending that there was going to be an invasion of the Philippines, and how should they defend it? And Marshall led the invaders and established a reputation throughout the Army as a wizard at organizing and organizing a massive battle of troops. And I think Henry Hap Arnold at the time was a young officer who witnessed Marshall's performance during that time. Hap Arnold became the head of the Air Force in World War II. And he wrote his wife saying that he just met a guy who will become Chief of Staff of the United States Army one day. And he was prophetic. So Marshall made his chops in the Philippines. And then, of course, every assignment he had leading up to the World War I, he wanted to get out of the Philippines and get back to the United States because he knew there was going to be, he thought there was going to be a war with Germany.
There's a lot we could talk about, and we only have a half an hour left, and I want to, so we may jump around a little bit, but there's some things I have to ask about. One is, during the First World War, General Pershing and his staff on short notice arrived by train at the 1st Division training area where Marshall was. As Pershing turned to leave, Marshall reached out and grasped his arm. General Pershing, there's something to be said here, and I think you should say it because I've been here. I should say it because I've been here longer. Marshall ticked off several reasons why the division's training progress had been inhibited, aiming much of the blame at Pershing's own headquarters staff. That seems like a good way to end your career in the Army.
I think he was a major at that point, and he was on the staff of the 1st Division, the Big Red One, and that was the division the division that was had gotten to France first, and Marshall had helped train them. His general, the general of the 1st Division, was General Siebert, and Marshall was loyal to him. And what Pershing had done is Pershing showed up at some maneuvers that they were doing, and in the front of all of the officers criticized General Siebert. He just ripped him up, saying this is a ridiculous thing. You haven't done this, you haven't done that, and why haven't you done this? And Marshall was standing there. Now Marshall had a temper, and the temper, I think, fueled what he did. But he decided to step forward out of all the officers and actually grabbed Pershing's arm and said, "Wait a minute, I know what's happened here." And he had the facts right there, and just a torrent of words came out. But basically, he said, we weren't able to do this because we didn't get this from the headquarters, and you told us to do this, but now you're criticizing for doing this, And so he came through a whole bunch of things, and Pershing, he wanted to get away. He said, "What is it?" And he started to depart, and he said, "Well, I'll look into it." And Marshall said, "There's no need to look into it. These are the facts." So Pershing then did go away. But like other occasions in his career, Pershing sensed that here was someone with integrity. Here was someone who knew what he was talking about. This was not somebody to be trifled with, and this is somebody that he respected. So speaking truth to power became one of Marshall's trademarks.
You have a scene in your book where he confronts Roosevelt at a meeting on something that he didn't
Similar
like that
thing.
Roosevelt said. Yeah.
Similar thing.
So he ended up working for Pershing.
And Pershing, he put him on his staff. He said, "I want this guy." So then as a result of that, he took him away from the 1st Division, and Marshall established himself in the 1st Division too. He organized the first attack that the American Army had during the war. But then when Pershing got him in his staff, he was planning huge maneuvers, and he famously planned and executed a brilliant nighttime movement of 600,000 American troops for the Meuse-Argonne campaign, and putting them in place by the assigned hour. He had 2 weeks to move 600,000 troops and equipment, putting them in place to win the decisive battle that ended the First World War.
What was his reaction to combat?
Well, he was in combat in a sense. He never led troops. He never went over the top with a sword or a saber, leading troops into no man's land. But in planning the first major engagement of the U.S. Army, the 1st Division's Battle of Cantigny in May of 1918, yes, he was in combat in the sense that every night for weeks before the battle, he went into no man's land himself, around 2 in the morning, 2 until dawn, planning and tracking, going into every aspect of the terrain, finding out where their artillery were. And he was under artillery attack. So it wasn't like, that's a form of combat. He wasn't having hand-to-hand combat with the Germans. But for weeks he was out there. And so he led that, he didn't lead the troops in that battle. The battle was successful. It's a small engagement comparatively, a small number of casualties. And then in the same thing in Meuse-Argonne, he was not under attack. He escaped. He was almost killed by a bomb at one point that somebody dropped out of a plane right near him.
He was almost killed a couple of times.
Yeah, he almost crashed when they were going to see MacArthur.
And also, he and a couple of other top generals were on a boat going to, was it a conference in Europe, and they were torpedoed by their own guys?
Famous incident. Going to the Tehran conference, they left the United States aboard a brand new battleship called the Iowa. It was a huge battleship, and Roosevelt and all the Joint Chiefs were aboard this battleship. They were on their way to North Africa, where they were going to fly to Tehran. And 2 days out in the Atlantic, they were suddenly under attack. And from the bridge, the sailor called out, "This is not an attack. This is no drill. This is no drill." And a torpedo wake came steaming toward the battleship Iowa, and they just managed to zigzag away from it. And it was by their own, by one of their own U.S. destroyers. And Harry Hopkins had so much fun with that. He made fun of it for the rest of the war. The Navy had almost destroyed the American high command.
What would George Marshall have been like to be around?
Well, it depends. He could be coolly impersonal, stoic, very little words, clipped words. When you got before him and you were there to report on a decision you were about to make or a recommendation, it was all business. There was no waste of time. He didn't have time. But when he relaxed, in the presence of family and friends, he could be a raconteur to some extent. His jokes were not always funny. He could be, he could be prissy. Nobody told dirty jokes around him. He told his form of funny stories. But he loved the outdoors. He had pals that he would fish and hunt with. Hap Arnold was one of them. He would take any opportunity he could to hunt and fish, ride. He was a great horseman. And he made deep, long, intimate relationships with this precocious young girl named Rose Page, who he befriended when she was only 8, and she was one of the last people to see him die when he was dying. A relationship that lasted 50 years. That was sort of amazing. A headstrong stepson. When he married the second time, he acquired a complete family. And there was one, the youngest boy in that family, he just loved. He formed a lifelong bond.
This is Alan?
Alan Brown. He mentored him. Alan played football. He was a wrestler. Marshall was his father, and his stepfather. He loved this kid. He did something amazing. In 1943, Alan had just graduated from the Fort Knox Tank School, itching to get into combat. And he wrote a letter to Marshall. His dream was to lead a tank platoon. Marshall issued a highly unusual secret order, and the order directed Alan through channels to join it was the 1st Armored Division. It was refitting in North Africa for possible action in Italy. Marshall got Alan into Italy, and Alan fought in Cassino, in his tank group. And his dream was, as I said, to lead the tank platoon. And his dream came true. He led the tank platoon after the Anzio breakout, 1944, May of 1944, right before D-Day. Alan was in Italy. Tough fighting. On the road to Rome, Alan was killed. And it was probably the most devastating personal thing that happened to Marshall and his wife Catherine at the time. Catherine's a whole different story, which I would love to tell at some point in this discussion.
Did Marshall ever write down personal thoughts, like how he felt about losing his stepson?
Never did. He never did. And he never wrote about what he must have felt when the command decision, the Overlord command decision, went to Eisenhower. Of course, he may not have actually wanted it. We'll get to that. But He didn't write about that. He didn't write about. Catherine wrote about her thoughts when Alan was
wife?
killed. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, his wife. She felt a blessed numbness. She said, "My guess is that Marshall was profoundly. My guess. I'm sure he was profoundly grieved by Alan, given his love for him, and we knew that. It was clear that he loved Alan beyond all the other children." That he had 3 children that he became his stepchildren when he married Catherine. So, and I bet he felt a tinge of regret at having gotten Alan into Italy in the first place. He was the one who sent him there.
But you said Marshall was not sure he wanted to be in charge of D-Day?
I think the record is not clear on that. There's no documentation of exactly how Marshall felt. And a lot of writers have said that Marshall coveted the command. I mean, he had been offered the command earlier, and he certainly didn't turn it down. But when it came to when Roosevelt had to make the decision, December 5th, 1943. They were in Cairo. Roosevelt called Marshall to his quarters. And he beat around the bush, as he always does. The command decision of Overlord, Operation Overlord, was going to take place early June of 44. That was the invasion of France. Here we were at Cairo in December 1943. Stalin had demanded at the Tehran conference, you have to decide who's going to be the commander. Overlord's not going to take place unless you appoint a commander. And Roosevelt was dithering. He didn't know he wasn't sure what he's going to do. And he whispered to Lovett or Bolin next to him. He said, "That old Bolshevik's trying to force my hand." That's what he whispered to. But in any event, December 5th, 1943, he says to Marshall, "Do you want to command Overlord? What do you want to do?" Marshall had so much respect. Eisenhower had so much respect. I'm sorry. Roosevelt had so much respect for Marshall that he would have appointed it. If Marshall said, "I want to command Overlord," it's almost certain that Roosevelt would have given it to him. But Marshall demurred. He didn't ask for it. So Roosevelt felt, well, maybe he doesn't want it. In fact, later he said, "I didn't think he did want it." But a lot of Marshall's friends said he did want it. Marshall never said one way or the other. Instead, he said, "Well, Mr. President, you should feel perfectly free to decide this question according to the best interests of the country and not to consider my feelings."
You have a quote in here that has gotten some play where Roosevelt said, I didn't feel I could sleep at ease if you were out of Washington.
Right. And that meant he wanted him to stay there and control the whole command structure, which he had been doing. And it's possible that Marshall felt and Marshall was selfless in many respects, that it would be better for him to stay in Washington, where he could continue to influence the course of this global war. It wasn't just Overlord. They were talking about the Mediterranean, the Pacific, Burma, everywhere. So he may have said to himself, I really want to command Overlord, but it's better for the country for me to stay in Washington. I'm not willing to make that judgment as to which way what he really felt in the absence of a document.
Marshall was chief of staff while Roosevelt died and Truman took over. What kind of change was a result of that? How did he get along with Harry Truman?
Well, one thing he said, they met with Truman almost the day that I think it was either the evening or the day after Roosevelt died. Marshall was in the White House right away because Mrs. Roosevelt wanted to organize the funeral. But when they left that meeting with Truman, Marshall said to, I think it was Bob Lovett or Chip Bolin, he said, "We won't know what he's like," meaning Truman, until the pressure is on. But it didn't take long for Marshall and Truman to have a good relationship. Truman was much more forthright, much more easier to read. You know, what Truman said, he did. He was Mr. Common Sense, Mr. Plain Speaking, as they always said. And, Marshall felt a lot more comfortable around Truman. And Truman revered Marshall. I mean, Marshall was on a pedestal as far as Truman was concerned. So they got off to a much quicker, good relationship than Marshall ever did with Roosevelt.
What kind of role did Marshall have in the decision to drop the A-bomb?
Well, he had views on it, but what Truman did is he appointed a top-level civilian committee to make a recommendation on dropping it. And the other options were, blockade, invasion, huge amounts of casualties would be incurred if there were invasion. Blockade would take long. Maybe the Soviets, if they came in, would cause the Japanese to surrender. All these things were up in the air. But he appointed a committee once they had the bomb. They knew it would work, and they had two of them. They appointed a high-level committee that Marshall wasn't on. But he told Stimson, Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, was on the committee. So just before they began having their meetings, Marshall said, we have to worry about civilian casualties. You can't just drop it on millions of Japanese citizens. So he was one of the few to recommend some sort of a warning or keep it away from civilians. Stimson was on the committee. The committee prevailed on the dropping the bomb. That was Jimmy Burns, who was one of the most influential people on that committee. And Truman had never had a second thought. He said, we're going to drop these bombs, one bomb at least. And Truman kind of convinced himself that, well, we're going to bomb it on a city which has a military installation in it. And he figured that was good enough, even though these installations were surrounded by workers. I mean, they were living right next to these factories. So not a lot of thought was given to that, given the casualties, that there was racism involved. There was a lot of other issues that came into play on that. But once the decision was made, Marshall backed it. He didn't object.
Was he well known at the time? I mean, was he in the news and quoted in the newspapers?
Always. Yeah. His figure, I think his picture was on the front of Time magazine 2 or 3 times. Yes, he was. He played the press. He dealt with the press. He dealt with them on a confidential basis where it was off the record. He met with a group of top reporters in Washington regularly, briefed them on what was going on. He felt that was important. And then he most of it was off the record. But then he would go on the record and give speeches. When they were doing the Marshall Plan, PR was a big deal to get the American people to come around on supporting the Marshall Plan. American public opinion played a big role in that.
We could probably spend half of this interview just talking about the Marshall Plan, and he had an extensive post-World War II career. But would you talk about the Marshall Plan? Just bring people up to speed for people who might not remember.
To do it briefly, but when Marshall was Secretary of State in 47 to 48, and in 47, first personnel move he made, within 3 or 4 weeks after he was Secretary of State, he said, I want George Kennan here at the Secretary of State's office to be head of policy. We need a policy planning office. We need to think about, where we're going to be, what we're doing. We can't just, react from one thing to another. He brought George Kennan. George Kennan had been in Moscow. George Kennan knew Russia better than anybody in the country. Probably almost more than the Russians themselves know. He'd lived in Russia for years. Brilliant guy. Brilliant personnel move. And Kennan had written a telegram in 1946 called the Long Telegram. And if you read it today, it's prophetic. It explains more about Russia and its culture and its heart and its soul than anything I've ever seen. And it explains what Russia's doing today. So anyway, everybody in Washington knew about this Long Telegram. So he brought Kennan in. Then he goes off to Moscow for his first taste of the Russians. It's a foreign ministers meeting. And they're getting nowhere about what we're going to do with post-war Europe. He finally gets a meeting with Stalin. Stalin says, don't worry, let's just let it ride for a while, we'll see what happens. And he came away from the meeting with Stalin as, Stalin doesn't care what happens to Europe. He wants his bloc of Eastern European countries. He wants communists to spread across the entire continent. And he wants them to be in poverty, because communists will take over the whole Western Europe. Marshall arrives back in Washington and says, we got to get to work. We have to have a plan. This guy wants to take over all of Europe. And he doesn't want to go to war. What he wants to do, he wants to do it with economics. So they get Kennan, they get Chip Bolin, they get a guy named Will Clayton, who is unknown, but he's the most successful cotton trader in the world. He made a fortune. He was working for the government $1 a year in the State Department. He knew trade. So he gets Clayton, and he gets Atchison, he gets Kennan, and they're working on a plan. Later became known as the Marshall Plan, a way to restore the economics, and the trading capability of Western Europe. So Marshall, meanwhile, doesn't tell anybody. He gets Bolin and Kennan and Atchison, to some extent, help him write a little speech. And he calls up the president of Harvard, Conant, says, I'd like to get that honorary degree you've always wanted me to get at the commencement, June of 1947. I'm going to give a little speech, not a big deal. So he gave a speech, not the commencement speech, but a speech to the alumni later in the afternoon. And it was the speech that introduced the Marshall Plan to the world. Senator Vandenberg, a Republican isolationist who had turned internationalist, called it, and he was there then. The Republicans were in charge of Congress. Vandenberg, the head of the Foreign Relations Committee, said it was a shot heard around the world. The British listened to it, and the French listened to it, and they finally had some hope. America may do something. So they put together the plan, and the plan was, the elements of the plan were, and Marshall outlined these elements in the speech, it's up to the European countries to come up with a plan. We're not going to tell them how to do it. We're going to tell them we're going to support it, and we're going to give them some money. But they have to come up, they have to integrate, get together, stop squabbling, and come up with an integrated plan of how they feel the economies should be restored. It's up to them. And that was a key component. And then, what about the Russians? Should we offer it to the Russians and to the Eastern Europeans, Poland, and all those? And Kennan said, yes, offer it to them. They won't take it. If they did take it, they would have undermined it. So they offered it. They offered it to anybody. And so that got it off the ground. And the Russians did not take it. Stalin wouldn't have it because he said, I don't want them messing around with my economy. I want to continue whatever I'm doing. So for the next, it took him another almost a full year to get it through Congress. And Marshall was the spearhead. He was the voice. He was the face, as was Senator Vandenberg. And they worked together. They lived with each other. Vandenberg needed to be courted. He needed to put his stamp on the plan. He did that. But the plan finally got through and finally appropriated in June, a year later. But it was the hope, it was the psychological lift that just brought Germany and France, Britain, Netherlands, Italy. Congress was aboard. One interesting thing is Nixon was a freshman congressman at the time. Nixon was one of the delegation. They sent him to Italy to assess the economy in Italy and whether the Marshall Plan might work and all that. And these congressmen came back, a lot of them Republicans, and they were all on board. They want to help this country. They want to do this. And Nixon became a great proponent. So they got the Republicans, the Democrats. They came together. It was nonpartisanship like we'll never see again, I'm afraid.
I wish we had time to keep talking because there's a lot more to talk about Senator Joe McCarthy got George Marshall in his crosshairs for a while, and the founding of the State of Israel, founding of NATO, the Cold War, and all that. But if you want to know all about that, you'll have to read the book, George Marshall, Defender of the Republic, and we've been speaking with author David Rohl. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Enjoyed it.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.